Put everything else aside for a moment. Seriously. Step away from whatever distraction is competing for your attention right now. Because what happened recently in New York may end up being remembered as one of those rare moments that quietly changes the direction of a continent. The remarkable part? Most people barely noticed it. 47 minutes. That's all it took for Canadian Prime Minister Mark Carney to walk into the heart of America's financial capital, stand before some of the most influential figures in the business world, and systematically challenge nearly every assumption Washington has been operating under regarding Canada over the last year and a half. Not in Ottawa, not in Vancouver, not even in Toronto. He did it in New York City, on American soil. And here's what almost nobody seems to fully understand. This wasn't merely a speech. It wasn't a routine policy address. It wasn't diplomatic theater. It was something much bigger. Every element was deliberate. The timing was deliberate. The audience was deliberate. The message was deliberate. And perhaps most importantly, the people in that room were exactly the people who needed to hear it. I've followed international politics and economic strategy for years, and I can tell you that very few speeches continue to echo in your mind after they're over. This one did. Because what Carney said, and what he intentionally left unsaid, offers a glimpse into a future that looks very different from the one most people still assume is coming. If you're not subscribed yet, now is the time, because we're about to break down what happened piece by piece, and I promise you, there are layers to this story that are being missed almost everywhere else. Let's begin. The first thing you need to understand is where this happened. The Economic Club of New York isn't just another speaking venue. This isn't a place where politicians drop by for publicity. This isn't a room designed for campaign slogans or television sound bites. This is one of the most influential stages in global finance. When central bankers want to send subtle signals to markets, they speak here. When major financial institutions want to gauge the future direction of policy, they pay attention to this room. The people who gather there are often responsible for decisions involving trillions of dollars. Investment managers, corporate executives, financial strategists, institutional power brokers, the kind of people whose conversations quietly shape economic realities long before the public notices. Everyone in attendance understood immediately that Carney's appearance carried significance. And Carney understood that they understood. Nothing about this event happened by accident. Not the location, not the audience, not the moment. Remember who was standing at that podium. This wasn't simply a politician giving remarks. This was the former governor of the Bank of Canada, the former governor of the Bank of England, the only individual ever to lead the central banks of 2 G7 nations. By the time someone with that resume walks onto a stage like that, half the message has already been delivered before a single sentence is spoken. Then Carney began. His opening observation was straightforward. The United States, he argued, has fundamentally altered the nature of its commercial relationships. There was no attempt to soften the statement, no effort to wrap it in diplomatic language. No elaborate introduction, just a direct acknowledgement of reality. But that wasn't the most important part. The real signal came immediately afterward. Carney noted that Canada recognized these changes earlier than most countries did. At first glance, that sounds harmless, even complimentary. But listen carefully, because buried inside that statement was a criticism sharp enough to reshape the entire conversation. What he was effectively saying was simple. We saw this coming. Long before the headlines, long before the disputes, long before the political arguments reached their current intensity. While others were assuming old arrangements would continue indefinitely, Canada was already preparing for a different future. And according to Carney, that preparation is no longer theoretical. It's already underway. He explained that over the previous year, Canada had finalized more than 20 economic and security agreements spanning multiple continents. Think about that for a moment. 20 agreements across different regions in a single year. That doesn't happen because a government suddenly panics. That doesn't happen because officials wake up one morning and decide they need alternatives. That requires planning, coordination, diplomatic infrastructure, institutional focus. It requires a long-term strategy. What Carney was describing wasn't improvisation, it was execution. While political attention remained focused on Washington, Canada appears to have been quietly building relationships around the world, and the scale is larger than many people realize. Canada already possesses trade access reaching approximately 1.5 billion consumers through existing agreements stretching across Europe and the Pacific region. For many countries, that alone would be considered a major achievement, but Carney wasn't presenting that as the destination. He was presenting it as the starting point. Because according to the roadmap he outlined, Canada expects to dramatically expand that reach through new partnerships involving India, Southeast Asia, Mercosur nations, Thailand, and the Philippines. If those efforts succeed, Canadian businesses could gain access to markets approaching 3 billion people. 3 billion. Pause and think about that number. 3 billion consumers, 3 billion potential customers, 3 billion opportunities, existing beyond the direct influence of whatever trade policies emerge from Washington in the coming years. And then Carney introduced a concept that may have been the most revealing part of the entire address. He explained that these partnerships are not simply about increasing trade. They're about something deeper. Strategic autonomy. That phrase matters because it changes the conversation entirely. Market access is economic. Strategic autonomy is geopolitical. One concerns business, the other concerns power. And then came a word that immediately captured attention. Weaponized, Carney suggested that modern economic integration can be transformed into a tool of pressure, a source of leverage, a mechanism through which dependence becomes vulnerability. That wasn't accidental language. Words like that don't appear in speeches delivered at the Economic Club of New York unless they're intended to send a message. Every executive in that audience understood exactly what he meant. Every investor understood. Every trade specialist understood. The point wasn't subtle. Canada has concluded that dependence carries risks, and going forward, it intends to reduce those risks wherever possible. That's what happened in New York. Not a speech, a strategy, not a complaint, a declaration, and it was delivered calmly, methodically, and with remarkable confidence. But here's where the story becomes even more fascinating, because everything we've discussed so far might still sound like prudent diversification. A country expanding its options, a government pursuing sensible international relationships. Nothing particularly shocking. After all, Canada remains a nation of roughly 40 million people. The United States remains the largest economic power on Earth. So how much difference can any of this really make? That question brings us to the moment that completely changed the room. And honestly, it's the moment I had to replay multiple times to fully appreciate what had happened. Standing before hundreds of America's most powerful financial figures, Carney delivered a sentence that instantly reframed the entire debate. A stronger Canada, he argued, helps make America great again. The silence that followed was impossible to miss, because in that single sentence, Carney did something extraordinarily clever. He took one of the most recognizable political slogans in modern American history and turned it into an argument against the policies being pursued in its name. Not through mockery, not through insults, not through confrontation, but through logic. Calm, measured logic. He wasn't attacking Trump personally. He wasn't engaging in partisan rhetoric. Instead, he was suggesting that a prosperous and confident Canada actually serves American interests better than economic conflict ever could. And he delivered that message directly to an audience capable of influencing conversations throughout Washington. People who fund campaigns, people who allocate capital, people whose opinions often travel farther than press releases ever do. 5 carefully chosen words. That's all it took. And suddenly the entire discussion looked different. But Carney wasn't finished, not even close, because the next section of his remarks moved into energy. And that's where the numbers become impossible to ignore. Because once Carney shifted into energy, the conversation stopped being theoretical. Now we were talking about leverage, real leverage, the kind that powers economies, heats homes, keeps factories operating, and determines which countries possess genuine influence when relationships become strained. And this is where the scale becomes difficult to ignore. Carney pointed out that nearly all natural gas imported into the United States comes from Canada, nearly all of it. The overwhelming majority of imported electricity flowing into the United States originates north of the border as well. A significant share of crude oil imports follows the same pattern. These aren't just statistics buried inside government reports. These are the foundations of everyday life. The heat that keeps homes comfortable during brutal winters. The electricity supporting data centers, hospitals, and transportation systems. The fuel powering manufacturing facilities across entire regions of the country. In other words, these are not optional relationships. They're structural relationships. They're woven directly into the functioning of the North American economy. Then Carney explained where Canada intends to go next, and this is where the room became especially attentive. By the end of this decade, Canada expects to dramatically increase its liquefied natural gas exports, not by a small margin, by an amount substantial enough to transform Canada's position within global energy markets. And according to the long-term plans being discussed, that capacity could expand even further during the following decade. But perhaps even more significant was what came next. Canada is building infrastructure designed to move massive volumes of energy toward international markets beyond North America, not westward toward the United States, across the Pacific, toward Asia, toward some of the fastest growing energy consumers on Earth. Think carefully about what that means. For decades, one of the central assumptions shaping North American trade discussions was that Canada's options were limited, that geography created dependence, that economic realities would ultimately force Canada back toward Washington whenever tensions emerged. That assumption formed the foundation for countless strategic calculations. And according to Carney, that assumption no longer reflects reality. Because while political debates have dominated headlines, Canada has been constructing alternatives, not theoretical alternatives, physical alternatives, pipelines, export facilities, trade agreements, infrastructure, partnerships, the kind of assets that take years to build and decades to replace. Then he moved into another area where Canada appears determined to expand its influence: nuclear energy, critical minerals, electricity generation, advanced energy technologies. One by one, Carney outlined projects already underway, new investments, new partnerships, new production capacity, new sources of capital. Taken individually, each announcement sounded important. Taken together, they sounded transformational, because the broader picture was becoming clear. Canada wasn't simply responding to change. Canada was preparing for a world where flexibility itself becomes a strategic advantage. And here's the part that many observers still seem to be missing. The pipeline heading toward Asian markets may be the most consequential element in the entire story. Because everything changes once a country develops viable alternatives. Leverage only exists when options are limited. The moment alternatives become credible, the balance begins to shift. For years, the underlying assumption in many political circles was straightforward. Canada needs access to America more than America needs access to Canada. Eventually, Canada will have no choice. Eventually, Canada will compromise. Eventually, Canada will return to the existing framework because there is nowhere else to go. What Carney effectively announced in New York is that Canada no longer accepts that premise. The country isn't searching for alternatives, it is building them. And according to the roadmap he presented, many of those alternatives are already taking shape. The customers exist, the investment exists, the infrastructure is being developed, the partnerships are expanding, and perhaps most importantly, the political determination appears stronger than ever. Now I want you to think about the practical implications, not the geopolitical implications, not the diplomatic implications, the practical implications. Imagine a family living in the American Midwest. Their utility bills have risen, their costs have increased. Inflation continues affecting everyday decisions. Many of those pressures originate from disruptions inside systems that were once deeply integrated. Systems designed around efficiency. Systems designed around predictability. Systems designed around cooperation. When those systems become strained, the consequences don't remain inside conference rooms. They show up in monthly expenses. They show up in business costs. They show up in consumer prices. At the same time, the country supplying enormous portions of the energy supporting those systems is investing heavily in routes that lead elsewhere. Not as punishment, not as retaliation, not even as confrontation, as strategy. That's what makes this so important. Carney never presented these developments as threats. He didn't stand in New York and issue warnings. He didn't demand concessions. He didn't raise his voice. Instead, he framed everything as progress, as planning, as preparation, as confidence. And that approach may have made the message even more powerful, because structural changes rarely arrive with dramatic headlines. They arrive quietly, gradually, project by project, agreement by agreement, investment by investment, until one day everyone realizes the landscape looks completely different. That's the stage we're entering now. Canada isn't overturning the existing table. It's building another one, a larger one, a more diversified one. And by the time many people recognize how much construction has already occurred, much of the work will already be finished. That alone would have made the speech remarkable, but the most revealing part was still ahead. Because once the discussion moved beyond trade and energy, Carney began revealing a much broader strategic vision. And this is where most media coverage completely missed the point. Many outlets treated the speech as a simple Canada versus Trump story, a dispute over tariffs, a disagreement over trade, a clash between neighboring governments. But that interpretation barely scratches the surface. Because hidden beneath the headlines were three observations that fundamentally change how this entire speech should be understood. Three observations, three signals, three clues pointing toward a future much larger than any short-term political conflict. Let's start with the first one. The first hidden reality is that Canada is not merely diversifying, Canada is launching. Those two ideas sound similar. They're not. Diversification suggests reaction. It suggests adaptation. It suggests a country looking for alternatives because existing arrangements have become unstable. That's the version of events many people have accepted. But what Carney described doesn't fit that narrative. Not even close. What he outlined looked less like a reaction and more like the public unveiling of a strategy that has been developing for years. Think about everything already discussed: international agreements across multiple continents, critical mineral partnerships, major energy infrastructure projects, new export capacity, long-term industrial investments, advanced energy technologies. These are not initiatives that appear overnight. They require planning horizons measured in years, sometimes decades. They require political commitment across multiple administrations. They require institutions moving in the same direction for extended periods of time. That means the question may not be why Canada is reacting now. The more interesting question may be what Canada saw coming years ago, because whatever that answer is, it clearly influenced decisions being made long before most people started paying attention. And that realization leads directly into the second hidden reality, one that may actually be even more important than the first. The second hidden reality is where the conversation becomes truly global. Because despite the headlines, despite the trade disputes, despite all the attention focused on Washington, one of the most important moments of the entire event wasn't really about the United States at all. It happened during the discussion that followed Carney's prepared remarks, a discussion that received very little attention compared to the rest of the speech. And yet, in many ways, it may have been the most revealing section of the entire afternoon. Carney spoke about a meeting with Chinese President Xi Jinping. At first glance, it sounded like a routine diplomatic reference, the kind of thing political leaders mention regularly. But then he introduced a concept that immediately changed the nature of the conversation: the Thucydides Trap. Now, if you're not familiar with that term, here's why it matters. The idea comes from the ancient Greek historian Thucydides and his account of the conflict between Athens and Sparta. The theory is relatively simple. When an emerging power begins challenging an established dominant power, the resulting fear and uncertainty can make conflict increasingly likely. Not because either side necessarily wants war, but because the structural pressures surrounding competition become harder and harder to manage. In modern times, political scientist Graham Allison popularized this concept as a way of understanding the growing rivalry between the United States and China. Can the world's rising power and current dominant power avoid repeating the patterns that have defined great power transitions throughout history? It's one of the most important geopolitical questions of our era, and according to Carney, it was a subject that emerged during conversations with Xi Jinping himself. China's position has remained relatively consistent. Competition is unavoidable. Conflict is not. The challenge is finding a framework that allows both realities to exist simultaneously. But here's what made Carney's comments so fascinating. He wasn't discussing the Thucydides Trap as an academic concept. He wasn't giving a lecture. Canada wanted the people sitting in that room to understand that the old assumptions are no longer sufficient. The world is changing. The calculations are changing. And according to the vision outlined in New York, Canada intends to change with them. The blueprint has been revealed. The question now is whether the rest of the world fully understands what it is looking at, and perhaps more importantly, whether it understands how much of that blueprint is already being built. So now I want to hear from you. Which of these futures do you think is most likely? Does the relationship eventually stabilize? Does it continue evolving in a completely new direction? Or are we witnessing the beginning of a broader realignment that will reshape North America for decades to come? Let me know your thoughts below. And if you found this breakdown valuable, make sure you're subscribed. Because the next few years may prove to be some of the most consequential years this continent has seen in generations.